Hello, friends. If you're curious about the movie Conclave 2024, you're in the perfect place. Don't forget to give this video a quick like, it really helps us out. And if you're new here, hit subscribe to stay updated on all the latest movie deep dives. Let's jump right in. Some stories begin with a bang, a storm, a death, but this one begins with silence. Sacred silence. The kind that hangs heavy in the air beneath painted ceilings and towering saints, echoing softly through marbled corridors as a world holds its breath. A man has died. Not just any man, but the Holy Father, the voice of over 1 billion souls. And with his death, a seat has been left empty. A throne not of gold, but of divine mystery. A throne that now must be filled. In the hidden chambers of Vatican City, the ritual begins. The cardinals have gathered, men draped in crimson, carrying centuries of faith, secrets, ambitions, and burdens with every step. They arrive from every corner of the globe, each one stepping into history, knowing full well that before they leave, one of them will emerge wearing white. The ritual is ancient, but the tension? Brand new. Because this time, something feels different. This time, shadows move behind the icons, and questions swirl behind every carefully composed smile. The setting is cloistered, suffocating. Mobile phones are surrendered. The world is locked out. And within the Sistine Chapel's echoing vastness, guarded by Michelangelo's gaze, the decision begins to take shape, not in grand declarations, but in whispers, glances, unspoken promises. And standing in the midst of this holy storm is one man who shouldn't even be there. He's not a cardinal, not even ordained. But he's been summoned, unexpectedly, by the dying Pope himself. A trusted figure, known for discretion, intellect, and a complicated past. Now he finds himself in the heart of power, a witness to the world's most secretive election. But what he witnesses isn't simply a sacred vote. It's something darker, deeper. A truth buried beneath the robes and rituals, waiting to surface like a serpent beneath still waters. At first, the ceremonies follow the expected path. There's reverence, liturgy, the casting of votes on parchment, burned with resin and straw, black smoke. Still waiting. The world watches. Rain falls across St. Peter's Square. Cameras flicker. But within the chapel walls, tensions rise. Old alliances are tested. Hidden agendas emerge. And our central figure, quiet, watchful, realizes that the conclave isn't just choosing a pope. It's hiding something. The air grows thick with more than incense. Secrets stretch back decades, tethered to the late pope's final hours. Why did he summon an outsider? What did he fear? Why are certain cardinals growing more agitated with each failed vote? And why, amid the sacred chants, does the silence feel more menacing than peaceful? There's a cardinal from Africa, charismatic, composed, but hiding a strange apprehension when the subject of the late pontiff's final letters is mentioned. A cardinal from America, progressive and vocal, stirring tension beneath the surface. An older Italian prelate, stoic and watchful, whose calm demeanor hides the weight of old knowledge. Each man is a thread, and someone among them, is pulling the strings. As the ballots continue and the smoke refuses to turn white, the story turns in on itself like a winding staircase. The outsider begins to unravel a mystery wrapped not just in doctrine but in danger. He uncovers fragments, a hidden letter, a coded message, a name whispered only once before being lost forever. A hidden corridor beneath the archives. A clue left behind in the most sacred of texts. But every discovery brings consequence. The closer he moves to the truth, the more the tension tightens. Eyes follow him. Warnings are spoken beneath breath. And the votes, strangely, begin to shift. Names change. Unexpected alliances form. And somewhere in the midst of it all, the dead Pope's voice lingers, not in ghosts or visions, but in the echo of choices left behind. Because what the story reveals, slowly and with aching suspense, is that this conclave is not about electing a shepherd. It's about preserving a truth. A secret so explosive that if revealed, it could fracture the very foundation of the church. One man already died to protect it, and someone else is willing to kill again. There's a pivotal moment deep into the story, a confrontation in the chapel's side chamber, where candlelight casts long shadows across the frescoes, and faith collides with fear. The outsider faces one of the front-runner cardinals, a man whose eyes no longer sparkle with divine calling but burn with desperation. It's in that moment that theology falls away. This is no longer about God. It's about men, about the weight of power and what it costs to carry it. From there, the narrative accelerates, not with action in the traditional sense, but with revelation. Truths untangle in confessionals. Betrayals unravel in the quiet hiss of incense. And every vote cast is no longer a gesture of faith, but a shield, each cardinal trying to ensure not only the outcome but their own safety. The outsider, no longer just observing, becomes central to the very choice itself. Forced to make a decision that challenges everything he believes, about loyalty, about truth, about salvation. Because buried within the conclave is a letter, a final letter, written by the late Pope, addressed to him. And its contents? They turn the entire election on its head. This isn't just about who will wear white. It's about whether the institution survives what's been hidden within it. The story balances on a knife edge between reverence and rot. It paints its world with soft light and whispered prayers, but also with locked doors, ancient sins, and the eternal question of what holiness looks like when men wear its mask. And by the time the white smoke finally rises into the air above the square, signaling to the world that a new pope has been chosen, the audience understands. This wasn't a selection. It was a survival. Because the man who steps out onto that balcony at the end doesn't just inherit the world's gaze. He inherits everything buried beneath it. This tale is wrapped in velvet and iron. A chamber piece that becomes a thriller. A sacred ritual that becomes a battle. With each turn of the key, each vote cast, and each word left unsaid, the story inches closer to the kind of truth that can't be burned away in a plume of smoke. It lives. It lingers. And in the silence that follows the final bell, it waits. Because this is a story that knows power is never just about titles. It's about what men are willing to do to keep them. It begins not with thunder or revelation, but with the low murmur of prayer echoing off marble. A sacred hush has fallen over Rome. Beneath the ancient stone of the apostolic palace, the faithful gather in tight clusters. Some clasp rosaries, others simply stand still, their breath catching in their throats as the news begins to trickle through the cobbled streets and into the heart of the Vatican. The Pope has died. There is no chaos, just gravity. An entire world holds its breath, not because of uncertainty, but because of what comes next. The sacred machine has been set in motion. The body is still warm when the calls go out, summoning the College of Cardinals from every corner of the globe. The process is ancient, formal, shrouded in ritual, but that doesn't make it simple. Or safe. In the hours that follow, jets cross oceans. Processions wind through Vatican gates. The men in red arrive in waves, 90, 100, more, each draped in their own stories, ambitions, secrets. One carries his humility like armor. Another, his charm like a blade. They speak in Latin, in whispers, in eyes that search and study long before a single ballot is cast. And at the heart of this delicate choreography is a man who does not belong. Murray is not a cardinal, not a bishop, not even ordained. He is, by canon law, invisible in this setting, a layman with no formal place in the centuries-old ritual. But here he stands, summoned in secret by the dying pope just days before his death. He's a former Jesuit, a man who walked away from the priesthood for reasons only half-whispered among those who knew him. Now a master of ceremonies for Vatican protocol, he's kept close to the throne, but never this close. The invitation is cryptic. A hand-delivered note, signed by the Holy Father himself. No explanation. Just a command to attend the conclave as an observer. Not to vote, not to speak, but to be present. Why? He doesn't know. And that question gnaws at him like a prayer half-answered. As the doors of the Sistine Chapel close behind them, sealing the cardinals in with a silence deeper than any cathedral hymn, Murray finds himself standing at the edge of power. Above him, Michelangelo's Judgment Day looms. Around him, men begin the slow, sacred process of electing a new leader of the Catholic Church. But almost immediately, something feels off. The first ballots come quickly. Tradition is honored. Names are read, tallied, burned. The black smoke drifts above the square. No decision. But inside, beneath the formal nods and scriptural readings, there's a tension that crackles. Old rivalries resurface. Eyes dart. Words are chosen carefully, but with unmistakable weight. Murray watches. And listens. It's not long before he notices peculiarities, things too subtle for the outside world to catch. A brief exchange between two senior cardinals, whispered and cut short as he passes. A sealed envelope passed from hand to hand before disappearing into the folds of a crimson robe. A look of recognition between two men who publicly claim no history. He begins to realize that the conclave isn't merely divided, it's wounded. Fractured. Outside, the world watches the chimney, waiting for white smoke. But inside, smoke of another kind rises. Metaphorical. Dangerous. Murray is given access to a side room of the chapel, a chamber used for rest and meditation during the long hours between votes. And in that room, tucked behind a forgotten alcove, he finds something that shifts everything. A letter. Signed by the late Pope. Addressed to him. It isn't a confession. It's a warning. A whisper from the grave about something that happened years earlier. An event buried so deep within the archives of the church that even Murray, with all his access, never found it. The letter doesn't name names, but it speaks of a betrayal. Of knowledge suppressed. And of someone within the college who cannot be allowed to wear the white robes. Suddenly, his presence makes sense. He wasn't called here to witness history. He was called to protect it. Armed with the letter, Murray begins to move quietly through the chambers, using his role as master of ceremonies to observe without drawing attention. He becomes a ghost in cassock and collar. And what he sees confirms the letter's implications. Certain cardinals are pressing for quick resolution, pushing a specific name to the top of each vote. A name that, by all accounts, should be controversial, but somehow is gaining momentum. Cardinal Tremblay. Young, eloquent, magnetic. A favorite of the press. He represents a modern face of the church, someone the world might embrace. But Murray senses something beneath the polish. His eyes are too sharp. His speech is too perfect. And the men backing him, several from the late Pope's inner circle, seem united not in faith, but in fear. Murray tries to ask questions, discreetly. But doors close quickly. The Vatican, though cloaked in ceremony, is built on politics. Power here is a currency wrapped in ritual. And he is not a buyer. Still, clues begin to surface. An old confessional ledger, misfiled in the sacristy, references a scandal buried during the late Pope's earliest years. A letter from a deceased cardinal, long ignored, reappears in the archives. Even a painting in the papal apartments, one Murray had seen 100 times before, suddenly offers a new layer of meaning. A figure at the edge of the Last Supper, holding a key not to heaven, but to something darker. But even as the puzzle pieces start to align, the air around him grows more dangerous. A cardinal falls ill under mysterious circumstances. A message meant for Murray never arrives. And when he tries to speak with one of the papal guards about a strange figure seen near the archive doors after hours, he's told, firmly, to stop asking questions. The conclave continues. Votes are cast. The names shift. But the rhythm feels orchestrated, not organic. As though someone is guiding the outcome, ballot by ballot, toward a result they've been planning for years. And as Tremblay's support grows, Murray begins to see it, a pattern of alliances tied not to theology, but to silence, to what isn't being said. Then, during a midnight storm that rattles the old windows of the Apostolic Palace, Murray finds a passage hidden behind the sacristy wall, an old access tunnel used by papal attendants centuries ago. Inside, covered in dust and candle soot, is a locked chest, and within that chest, a journal. The late Pope's journal. It's not complete. Several pages are torn, others water-damaged. But what remains is damning. The Pope had been investigating something, a group within the Church, deeply embedded, whose loyalty was not to doctrine but to secrecy. Their goal wasn't to preserve the Church's mission, but to control its direction, to rewrite its future. Tremblay's name is circled, not as a member, but as their vessel, a man groomed to rise, a leader who would usher in not transparency, but consolidation, not spiritual renewal, but institutional entrenchment. Murray now understands. The Pope tried to stop it. He failed. And so he called Murray, not to expose it to the world, but to prevent it from reaching the chair of St. Peter. But the hour is late. The final votes are approaching. The pressure is mounting. And with each passing moment, the walls seem to close in, not just literally, but spiritually. The Sistine Chapel, once a sanctuary, now feels like a cage of angels and ghosts. Murray has no authority to speak. No vote. No voice. But he has the truth. And somewhere, deep inside these walls of red and white, incense and deception, he must find a way to let that truth be heard, before the smoke turns white. Before the world is told a lie it will believe for generations. It's quiet now, so quiet it feels like the walls are listening. Inside the Sistine Chapel, 100 heartbeats echo beneath the solemn gaze of God's final judgment. Black smoke curls again above St. Peter's, and the world waits. But within the chamber, something invisible is shifting. The votes are changing. The tempo of the room has altered, like a river redirecting its course. It's subtle, intentional, and dangerous. Murray feels it like pressure in the chest. He stands among men who carry centuries on their shoulders, who speak in Scripture but act with calculation. And behind each set of red robes, there is a game being played. Not openly, not crudely, but with quiet nods, softened words, the deliberate passing of paper just too fast to notice. Cardinal Tremblay's rise is no longer surprising. It's methodical. A campaign dressed in tradition. The whispers behind closed doors have become louder than the hymns. The journal, what little of it Murray could save, burns in his coat pocket like a confession waiting to explode. The Pope's words are clear. He tried to stop a conspiracy not of heresy, but of ambition. A movement within the Church that cloaked itself in orthodoxy, yet functioned like a political machine. Tremblay was not merely the candidate of choice, he was the vessel. Charismatic, modern, untarnished. But behind him stood the architects of something far older and far colder than belief. Murray finds himself cornered by time. The ballots are drawing near an irreversible threshold. One more vote, maybe two, and Tremblay will cross the line. And once the white smoke rises, once his name is declared from the balcony, the truth becomes irrelevant. The world will see only robes, not roots. Only the image, not the machinery beneath it. But what can he do? He has no voice, no vote, no permission to even speak within the chapel's sacred walls. And yet he was summoned, trusted, chosen. And in the absence of power, he begins to act, not with authority, but with truth. In the hours before the next vote, Murray seeks out Cardinal Bellini, one of the oldest electors, a man whose silence has always carried more weight than words. He shows him the letter. The journal. He speaks carefully, not of politics, but of prophecy, of rot, of what the papacy will become if this path is followed. Bellini listens, his eyes clouded with grief. He doesn't ask for proof. He doesn't doubt the story, because in his heart he already knew. Bellini agrees to delay the vote. Not openly, not in protest, but through procedure, raising theological questions that require debate, calling for prayer, asking for reflection, anything to stall. And in those stolen hours, Murray begins to unravel the rest. He returns to the secret corridor, the passage hidden behind the sacristy wall. There's more there, documents sealed in a drawer beneath the floorboards. Transcripts, letters, even a recording. All evidence that the late Pope had collected, tracing back years. Blackmail, secret appointments, reassignments that made no sense unless seen through this lens. And at the center of it all is Tremblay. Not evil, not a monster, but a man who made himself available to power, who allowed himself to be shaped into a symbol that those behind him could wield. Because the greatest trick is not to wear the crown. It's to control the one who does. With this knowledge in hand, Murray reaches out to a second cardinal, Cardinal Silva from Argentina. A progressive voice, often marginalized by the conservative bloc. A man of conviction. They meet in the gardens just before dawn, under the shadow of a statue of St. Peter holding the keys. Murray tells him everything. And this time, he gives him the journal. All of it. Not to destroy Tremblay, but to choose honesty. Silva reads in silence. Then simply nods. If this is true, he says, then we already know who the next pope must be. But it isn't Silva. It isn't Bellini. It isn't any of the frontrunners. It's someone else. Someone no one expected. A cardinal who had kept to the margins, never campaigning, never angling. A man named Cardinal Ajayi, from Nigeria. Respected, devout, humble, but more than that, untouched. The plan begins quietly. During the next round of voting, names begin to shift. Not many. Just enough to cause confusion. Ajayi's name appears more than once. Eyebrows rise. Tremblay still leads, but the margin is thinner. He notices. And when he does, he looks, not at the ballots, but at Murray. That's when the tension fractures. Tremblay confronts him. In private. It's not a threat. It's not a confession. It's something colder. He asks Murray, calmly, what he hopes to gain. You can't change the institution, he says. You can only guide it. Murray responds with only 4 words. You don't belong there. The final vote is called. Inside the Sistine Chapel, the ballots are cast in silence. One by one, names are written, folded, collected, burned. The smoke rises, and this time it's white. The world erupts in anticipation. Crowds flood the square. Cameras roll. Bells ring. And in the chapel, the name is read aloud. But it's not Tremblay. It's Ajayi. The room stills. Shock. Confusion. And then, slowly, applause. The momentum had been turned, not by force, but by conscience. By a handful of men who had chosen to break the chain. Tremblay stands still, unreadable. And then he bows his head. Not in reverence. In resignation. His moment is gone. Outside, the crowd parts as the balcony doors open. A figure steps forward, humble, steady, unfamiliar to most of the world, but radiant with something genuine. And as he speaks his first words as Pope, there is no thunder, no spectacle, just quiet power. Murray stands in the crowd, unseen. He isn't thanked. He isn't recognized. But he doesn't need to be. Because the moment isn't his. It never was. Later, as the square empties and the lights dim, he walks the Vatican's inner corridors one last time. Past the frescoes, the relics, the sealed doors. Past the chapel where history was almost hijacked. He pauses at the balcony, now empty. The air is cool. The city sleeps. And somewhere behind him, the church begins again. Not perfect, not pure, but possible. Because this time, truth spoke softly, but it spoke just loud enough to be heard. In a world sealed behind marble walls and ancient rituals, where voices echo beneath painted saints and secrets are disguised in liturgy, every character is more than who they appear to be. They carry masks crafted not from deceit, but from duty, some worn with purpose, others with fear. To understand them is to watch the way they breathe in silence, how their eyes hesitate when no one else is watching, how their faith bends under the weight of history. This is not a cast of saints and villains. It's a world of men, flawed, reverent, dangerous, and achingly human. At the center of it all is Murray. He walks like a man who has forgotten how to belong. Not because he's been cast out, but because he chose to step away. A former Jesuit who left the priesthood for reasons never publicly stated, he now serves quietly, respectfully, in the margins of the church's sacred machinery. He doesn't carry a title, only access. He stands in shadows cast by men who wear robes, watching with a quiet intelligence that most overlook. But there's a reason the dying pope chose him. Not a cardinal. He doesn't carry a title, only access. He stands in shadows cast by men who wear robes, watching with a quiet intelligence that most overlook. But there's a reason the dying pope chose him. Not a cardinal. Not a bishop. But a man who once stood within, left, and returned not for power, but for truth. Murray's strength is subtle. He doesn't wield power. He observes it. He listens while others preach. And when the conclave begins and he finds himself surrounded by the world's most powerful religious leaders, he doesn't flinch. He doesn't seek the spotlight. He moves like water, filling the cracks, slipping through barriers, discovering what others miss. But he is not passive. Beneath his soft-spoken presence is a fury, controlled, buried, but alive. A moral clarity that makes him dangerous to the order of things. He doesn't seek to expose. He seeks to protect. And it's that distinction that makes him the story's true soul. In Murray, we find the theme of conscience. Not as an abstract idea, but as a living, burning thing. He is a man constantly wrestling with the line between loyalty and integrity. When he uncovers the journal, the letters, the buried truths about what the church could become, his conflict isn't whether to act. It's how to act in a system that forbids voices like his. His silence isn't fear. It's strategy. His defiance is not shouted, it's delivered in the choices he makes when no one else is willing. But he is not the only one carrying weight. Cardinal Tremblay is his opposite, but not his foil. If Murray is the soul in exile, Tremblay is the soul on display. Young by Vatican standards, eloquent, and surgically charismatic, Tremblay is the future many inside the conclave believe the church needs. He smiles with humility, speaks with conviction, and moves with an elegance that feels almost choreographed. But what makes him dangerous isn't ambition, it's permission. He is a man shaped by others, chosen to lead not because he is the best, but because he is the most useful. There's a complexity to him that cannot be dismissed. He doesn't see himself as corrupt. He doesn't even see himself as a puppet. He believes in the church. He believes in its structure, its continuity, its need to stand firm against the tides of modern decay. He believes that truth is secondary to unity, that faith is safer when guided by strong hands. But he has stopped asking the hard questions. He has convinced himself that leadership is destiny, and destiny, once claimed, justifies everything. What's tragic about Tremblay is that he might have once been a man of deep conviction. But somewhere along the ascent, he made a choice, not to compromise, but to comply. And by the time he stands on the brink of the papacy, he can no longer see the difference. Then there is Cardinal Bellini, the elder statesman, the memory of the conclave. His voice is rarely raised, but when it is, others listen. He is old enough to remember scandal, old enough to carry the guilt of inaction. He sees the patterns repeating, the same choreography of power wearing new faces. His strength lies not in resistance, but in refusal. He will not be pulled again into the machinery. And when Murray brings him the truth, he does not need convincing. He knew. He always knew. But until that moment, he had lost the will to fight. Bellini's transformation is quiet and powerful. He becomes the bridge between the past and the present, between the church that hides and the church that must speak. His decision to support Ajayi, to slow the vote, to shift the tide, it's not political. It's penance. He is not seeking redemption. He is offering it to the church he failed to protect so many years ago. Cardinal Silva, on the other hand, is fire. From the moment he enters the conclave, he bristles at its pageantry. He's the voice of progress, an advocate for transparency, social justice, and reform. But his voice is often dismissed as too political, too modern. He carries the burden of being the outsider even within this inner circle. But when Murray shows him the Pope's journal, he doesn't gloat. He doesn't use it as leverage. He understands immediately what's at stake, and in doing so, reveals a depth of character that sets him apart. Silva represents the moral courage of acting, not because it's popular, but because it's necessary. His decision to help turn the vote isn't about ideology. It's about truth. He doesn't want to win a battle of beliefs. He wants to prevent a catastrophe. He is not the hero, but he is one of the few who risks something real to protect the institution from itself. And then, finally, there is Cardinal Ajayi. He is not a central figure in the beginning. He stands back, listens, prays. But the story watches him carefully. He is the man who has not asked to lead, who has not positioned himself in any circle, who simply walks through the conclave with humility, with quiet certainty, and with unshakable integrity. He has no agenda, and that is what makes him dangerous to those who do. Ajayi becomes the embodiment of the Church's potential, not its perfection, but its honesty. When the tide begins to shift toward him, he doesn't campaign. He doesn't resist. He simply receives. He understands what the role means, the weight it carries, the fire it walks through. And when he is elected, when his name is announced not with triumph but with reverence, he steps forward not as a conqueror, but as a servant. The supporting figures, too, each play a role in the story's emotional architecture. There are the silent cardinals, caught in the middle, torn between loyalty and fear. There are the handlers, the secretaries, the papal guards who know more than they're allowed to speak. Even the deceased pope, who never appears in the film except in memory and words, casts a long shadow. His decision to summon Murray, to trust a man without rank or robe, is the spark that lights the fire. And in his absence, the characters are forced to face what he saw too late, that the Church's greatest threat isn't from outside. It's from within. Together, these characters form a tapestry of belief, conflict, and reckoning. They don't move the story forward through plot twists or action. They carry it with decisions, with glances, with the slow, aching recognition that faith, when wielded without humility, can become a weapon. But what elevates this story beyond the intrigue of its setting is the way it treats its characters not as mouthpieces for ideology, but as people. People who ache. People who pray. People who compromise and regret and hope. And by the time the bells ring and the white smoke rises, every one of them has been changed. Not always for the better, but undeniably, irrevocably. The new pope steps onto the balcony. The crowd roars. The world watches. But it is Murray, standing alone, unseen, who reminds us that the most important changes are the ones that happen in the quiet. When the robes are hung up. When the cameras are gone. When the only question left is, what do we choose now? And in that question, every character finds their truth. Or runs from it. It's always the quiet ones that leave the deepest mark. The movies that whisper instead of shout, that choose candles over explosions, silence over spectacle. And yet, behind those whispers is often chaos, a quiet chaos full of strange accidents, bizarre coincidences, and stories so oddly poetic they feel scripted themselves. The making of this film was no exception. Behind the veil of red robes and Vatican secrets, the production unfolded like its own private mystery. And yet, behind those whispers is often chaos, a quiet chaos full of strange accidents, bizarre coincidences, and stories so oddly poetic they feel scripted themselves. The making of this film was no exception. Behind the veil of red robes and Vatican secrets, the production unfolded like its own private mystery. One that, if you listen closely, speaks in riddles and little revelations. It all started with a locked room, and a question that seemed impossible to answer. How do you recreate the most sacred and secretive ceremony in the world without ever being allowed to see it? The conclave, by its very nature, is cloaked in mystery. Cameras are forbidden. No recordings exist. The architecture of the ritual, the rhythm of the hours, the whispers passed between cardinals in ancient languages, it's all hidden from the world. Which meant the filmmakers had to do the unthinkable, invent authenticity. To capture the truth, they began by tracking down the few people in the world who had ever witnessed even fragments of the process. Former Vatican employees, liturgical consultants, a handful of retired clergy who had seen enough to speak in vague recollections. But even then, there were rules, unspoken lines they refused to cross. "It's not about secrecy," one of them said. "It's about reverence. The mystery is part of the point." Still, they listened, took notes, created diagrams based on memory and whispers. They sketched out the ritual in full, from the sealing of the chapel doors to the burning of the ballots. And then they built it from scratch. But the set itself quickly became something more. It wasn't enough to construct a replica of the Sistine Chapel. The crew decided to recreate it in meticulous, almost reverential detail, every fresco, every golden cornice, every crack in the paint. It was the most ambitious piece of production design many had ever attempted. One assistant described stepping onto the set for the first time as walking into a painting you weren't supposed to touch. The first strange thing happened on the day they finished installing the ceiling panels. As the final touches were made to Michelangelo's iconic Last Judgment, one of the overhead riggers accidentally dropped a light filter onto the floor. It shattered instantly, and right beneath the glass lay a small slip of paper. No one had seen it fall, and no one had placed it there. It simply read, "Be still." No one could explain it. They chalked it up to a misplaced note, a joke. But the timing was eerie. And from that day forward, crew members began to whisper about the Watcher. Not a ghost, not a haunting, but a kind of presence. Something about the set made people speak softer, move slower, as if the room demanded respect. Then came the robes. Costuming for a film like this wasn't just a question of fit or style, it was about weight, authenticity. The cardinal robes had to feel real, heavy, old world. But the production found that the original designs were so stiff and ceremonial that actors couldn't walk naturally in them. So the costume designer began weaving in hidden slits and secret clasps, allowing for freedom of movement that wouldn't show on camera. Still, more than one actor found themselves tangled during rehearsals. Gary, who played one of the more traditionalist cardinals, got so stuck in his vestments during a scene that he half-seriously called for an exorcist. Then there was the casting twist. The role of Murray, the central character, had been offered to a different actor originally, a name known for quiet intensity, someone who had played priests and detectives and diplomats before. But days before filming began, He pulled out for personal reasons. The production scrambled. Recasting the lead days before cameras roll is the kind of panic that sends studios into a tailspin. But then a name surfaced. Someone unexpected. An actor known more for modern dramas than spiritual thrillers. When he arrived on set, no one quite knew what to expect. But something about his quiet presence fit the role like a whisper. He moved differently. He listened differently. And within days, the director stopped giving him line readings. "He knows," he said. "He already knows the things we haven't told him." The film's composer had his own strange experience. While visiting a cathedral for inspiration, he reportedly fainted in the nave during a choral mass. When he came to, he claimed to have heard a phrase sung in Latin, one that kept looping in his mind. It became the foundation of the film's musical motif, repeated quietly throughout the score. When translated, the phrase meant, "What is hidden will be revealed." No one else remembered hearing it. Weather played tricks on them too. Filming took place primarily on sound stages, but on one of the few days they moved outside to shoot transitional scenes in a Roman-style courtyard. An unexpected fog rolled in. Thick, heavy, unnatural. The production was ready to cancel. But the director decided to shoot anyway. The resulting footage was eerie, otherworldly. It made the sequence feel like something half-dreamed. That fog stayed in the final catone of the strangest stories came from the props department. For a key sequence involving the Pope's personal journal, the team designed a book filled with handwritten pages, passages in Latin, sketches, notes. They hired a calligrapher to fill it, page by page. But on the third day, she stopped writing. She said she'd found a phrase in one of the pages she didn't remember writing. A line she swore wasn't hers. It said, "You were meant to see this." She laughed it off. But she finished the journal with gloves on, and never spoke of it again. On set, the actors, many of them seasoned veterans, began to feel the weight of their roles in unexpected ways. More than one admitted to dreaming in Latin. Several found themselves slipping into prayer between takes, not for character work, but because the atmosphere began to blur the lines between fiction and something else. A few crew members even reported mild sleep disturbances during the shoot, shared dreams, whispered voices. One night, a sound tech swore he heard chanting over his headset, even though the chapel was empty. And then there was the moment when production stopped completely. It happened without warning. In the middle of a tightly choreographed scene, all power to the soundstage cut out. Lights, cameras, monitors, gone. Dead silence. The backup systems failed to activate. For 5 minutes, the entire building sat in darkness. No panic. Just stillness. And during that silence, several people later said they felt watched. Like something had entered with the darkness. When power returned, no cause was ever found. The incident was never repeated. But those 5 minutes became known, on set, as the Black Smoke moment. But not all the stories were ominous. There were moments of surreal levity, too. During downtime, a group of actors who played cardinals began holding mock conclaves in the green room, complete with parody votes, whiteboard smoke signals, and one actor delivering daily papal briefings in a comically thick accent. The fake pope, crowned with a coffee filter tiara, was later honored in the wrap party with a custom robe that read, "Most Holy Espresso." One scene required a dove to fly across the set and land on a railing. The trainers prepared for weeks. But on the day of shooting, the dove refused to fly. Instead, it walked, slowly, purposefully, across the floor and perched itself on the foot of the lead actor just before his final monologue. It was so bizarrely perfect, the director kept the take. "You can't choreograph faith," he said. "You just let it land where it wants." And finally, the premiere. Held in a historic theater that had once been a church, the screening was attended by critics, clergy, skeptics, and believers alike. When the final scene ended and the credits began to roll, the room didn't erupt in applause. It didn't react loudly at all. It just sat there. Still. The silence wasn't discomfort, it was reverence. As if no one wanted to be the first to break the spell. Some films scream to be remembered. Others whisper and wait. And this one, shaped by strange notes, shattered glass, unplanned fog, and stories no script could invent, left its mark not by being loud, but by being uncanny. It told a tale of power, of secrecy, of spiritual tremors. And behind the scenes, it carried that same rhythm. Something was always watching. Or maybe, just maybe, something was waiting to be seen. It begins with a death. Not a violent one, not dramatic, but quiet, the kind that reverberates deeper because of what it represents. The passing of a pope. A moment that, within the film's world, doesn't just trigger a ritual. It sets off an earthquake beneath centuries of stone. And in that silence, that breathless pause between what was and what comes next, the story plants its first seed. What follows is not merely a story about succession. It's about truth. About legacy. About what happens when faith, power, and human imperfection collide behind closed doors. Critically, the film hinges on a single idea, that the most consequential decisions in history are often made in silence. The decision to open with the Pope's death is more than a narrative device. It's a symbolic unmooring. The world, especially one rooted in ancient structure, finds its foundation cracked. And instead of descending into immediate chaos, the Church responds with formality, ritual, liturgy, choreography. But that's precisely what makes it unsettling. The world may be trembling, but inside the Vatican, everything moves with quiet determination. That contrast, between institutional control and human frailty, is where the film begins to draw blood. Critics were quick to note the pacing of this first act. It's deliberate. It breathes. It doesn't race toward intrigue, but lets it unfold in whispers. The arrival of the cardinals. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The hushed Latin prayers. On the surface, it's all solemnity. But beneath, there's a rising tension that doesn't come from explosions or betrayals. It comes from the slow realization that something is wrong. That something is being hidden in the way the camera lingers on expressions just too controlled, in the subtle hesitations between greetings, in the unreadable glances that pass during liturgical moments. When Murray enters, the story tightens. From a critical lens, he is more than a protagonist. He is the audience's anchor. He walks into the sacred with the weariness of someone who has known both the divine and the human. His outsider status is a brilliant narrative decision. He understands the rules, but is no longer bound by them. He speaks the language, but no longer lives within it. That detachment allows him to see what others don't, or won't. The first major event that signals the shift beneath the ritual is the initial vote. Black smoke. A familiar sight. But inside, we watch the names being read. The tally marks. The reactions. And what critics have noted as particularly compelling is not the outcome, but the way the vote is shot. The camera glides, slowly, not to show grandeur, but to eavesdrop. It makes the viewer complicit in the process. And in doing so, the film makes a statement. Even within holiness, politics lives. As the votes continue, the tension doesn't come from overt sabotage or dramatic speeches. It comes from repetition. The sameness of the ritual becomes its own form of suspense. Each vote that results in black smoke isn't just a delay, it's a ticking clock. And through Murray's eyes, we begin to see that these delays are not accidental. They are orchestrated. Certain cardinals are shifting alliances too quickly. Others remain curiously silent. The frontrunner, Tremblay, rises not through passion, but through precision. His support doesn't swell, it glides. From a critical viewpoint, Tremblay's rise is one of the film's most subtly damning commentaries. He is not villainized. He is magnetic, reasonable, thoughtful. And yet, as we watch, the film quietly dismantles the notion of merit-based ascension. His campaign, though never named as such, is built on favors, fear, and the institutional need for a familiar face. Critics pointed to this as one of the film's strongest indictments of modern leadership, not just within the church, but universally. The idea that institutions, desperate for continuity, will choose the safest option even when it risks burying the truth. Then comes the letter. The moment Murray discovers the Pope's final words, sealed, hidden, addressed only to him, is the pivot of the film's moral axis. Critics have described it as the ignition point. Not because it explodes the story, but because it gives it purpose. The letter isn't melodramatic. It doesn't reveal everything. But it confirms what we've suspected, that beneath the robes and incense, something has gone wrong. And yet, even after discovering the letter, the film restrains itself. Murray doesn't storm into the chapel. He doesn't confront the cardinals. Instead, he watches. Strategizes. His mission is not to expose, but to understand. Critics praised this choice. It reinforces the theme that truth, real truth, isn't a weapon. It's a burden. And it must be carried carefully. What follows are a series of seemingly small events that build with devastating weight. A chance encounter in a hallway. A confession whispered by a dying cardinal. A vote interrupted by a question no one wants to answer. The cumulative effect is a slow, aching unraveling of certainty. Viewers begin to see how easily faith can be weaponized. How secrecy, when wrapped in sacredness, becomes indistinguishable from righteousness. The turning point, the decision to shift support toward Ajayi, is not treated like a coup. It's a quiet act of defiance. Critics highlighted the brilliance in how the film handles this transition. Ajayi is not lionized. He doesn't give speeches. He simply exists in contrast. Where others calculate, he listens. Where others maneuver, he prays. His rise is not framed as triumph, but as restoration. A recalibration of a balance that was quietly slipping. The final vote, when the smoke turns white, is perhaps the film's most emotionally complex moment. Because by then, the audience understands what's at stake. They've seen the hidden war. They've felt the weight of the journal, the whispers, the cost of truth. So when Ajayi is named, the reaction isn't elation. It's relief. A breath released after holding it for too long. But the film doesn't end with that resolution. And critics were quick to notice the final grace note, Murray, standing alone, unrecognized. No applause. No absolution. Just silence. He doesn't win. He doesn't lose. He endures. And in that endurance, the film says something far more profound than any monologue could. It says that integrity rarely gets a spotlight. That the people who protect truth often do so without thanks, without glory. They act in silence, so others can speak freely. From a thematic perspective, the film operates like a cathedral of ideas. Its structure is built on ritual, but its meaning lies in the cracks. Faith, power, secrecy, conscience, each brick layered in such a way that you only see the shape of the thing once you step back. And critics, across the board, responded to that architecture with reverence. Some called it a spiritual thriller. Others a meditation on leadership. Many compared it to stage plays, tight, internal, devastating in its restraint. And what most agreed on was that its power came not from what it shouted, but from what it whispered. It didn't force its audience to choose sides. It simply revealed the weight of every choice. Emotionally, the film resonates not because of grand gestures, but because of quiet ones. A hand brushing a relic. A glance shared between cardinals who know they've chosen differently this time. A man, once a priest, walking away from the center of the church not bitter, not broken, but still believing in something smaller, quieter, more sacred than power. And that's what gives the film its staying power. It doesn't pretend to fix the church. It doesn't indict it blindly or defend it desperately. It does something harder. It tells the truth. as much as it can, as gently as it must. And it lets us, the viewers, decide what to carry home. It's always curious how the quietest films, the ones wrapped in stillness, stained glass, and the echo of footsteps in sacred halls, so often have the loudest stories behind the scenes. This one, for all its meditative energy and slow-burn suspense, came to life in a world that was anything but still. The making of it was a balancing act, a game of reverence and invention, where every decision carried a strange kind of gravity. And yet, amid all the precision and polish, the chaos of creation slipped through in the most surprising ways. It began, not in a studio lot or high-rise production office, but in a series of clandestine conversations in Rome. The idea was bold: tell a story set entirely inside the most sacred and secretive ceremony on earth, the Conclave. A story about what happens when the Pope dies and power passes from one hand to another under the eyes of God and history. But there was a problem. No one knew what the inside of a real conclave looked like. That wasn't just a creative issue. It was a logistical nightmare. The Vatican doesn't give tours of the Sistine Chapel during a papal election. There are no cameras allowed, no transcripts, no backstage passes. The process is deliberately shrouded. That secrecy is tradition. Sacred. So the production team, unable to rely on research, did what any group of determined filmmakers would do. They made it up, very, very carefully. The production designer, an obsessive visual historian with a background in ecclesiastical architecture, began with the only references they could get their hands on: art books, drone footage of Vatican City, floor plans leaked decades ago, and interviews with people who had only ever seen glimpses of the conclave's rituals. From this patchwork, they built what would become the film's beating heart, a replica of the Sistine Chapel so detailed, so eerily precise, that it reportedly brought one visiting priest to tears. But recreating sacred space wasn't just about visuals. It was about presence. The set was enormous, built inside a soundstage that had previously been used for sci-fi films and dystopian thrillers. Transforming it into a space of holiness was surreal. A full team of painters worked for 6 weeks replicating the famed frescoes, brushstroke by brushstroke. And while the ceiling wasn't as high as the real one, clever camera angles and post-production enhancements made it feel infinite. The atmosphere became so convincing that cast and crew unconsciously lowered their voices on set. One day, an extra wandered onto the chapel floor during a break, looked up at the towering image of the Last Judgment, and whispered, "This is the closest I've been to a church in 10 years." He didn't say it with mockery. He said it with awe. The costumes were another world entirely. The cardinal robes weren't rented from costume houses. They were made, custom-tailored, using fabrics imported from Italy. Each piece had hidden weights sewn into the hems to mimic the heaviness of ceremonial garments. Actors spent weeks learning how to move in them. One joked that walking in full regalia felt like wading through velvet syrup. And then there was the casting. Finding the right actor to play Murray, the film's quiet, haunted center, took months. The role required something rare. Someone who could command a room without raising their voice, who could carry the film's moral weight while speaking barely more than necessary. When the final choice was made, it wasn't based on auditions. It was a single screen test. One scene, one page, no cuts. The director watched the playback and reportedly said, "He's not performing. He's remembering." That same ethos carried over to the rest of the cast. Every actor who played a cardinal underwent not just acting direction, but liturgical training. They were taught how to pray in Latin, how to handle relics, how to perform the rituals of the conclave with the gravity of men who had been doing it for decades. There were no shortcuts. No one was allowed to treat the robes like costumes. On set, they became vestments. And yet, the reverence didn't stop the madness of production from creeping in. One day, while shooting a dramatic vote-counting scene, the ceiling rig failed. A dozen overhead lights snapped out in a single blackout. What was supposed to be a moment of intense, sacred silence turned into full chaos. But the director didn't call cut. The camera kept rolling. And the actors, immersed in the moment, used the sudden darkness. They lit candles. Continued the scene. The tension became real. When the footage was reviewed later, that take was chosen for the final cut. Another day, one of the actors accidentally dropped a folded ballot into a coffee mug instead of the ceremonial urn. Laughter erupted across the set. The crew turned it into an inside joke. Every day after that, someone would leave a mock ballot in someone's cup, votes for everything from best craft services to most papal beard. There were surprises behind the camera, too. The sound team spent weeks designing the chapel's acoustic profile to feel real. They added micro-delays, reverb, even the soft flutter of robe fabric as characters passed by. During one scene, they recorded actual whispers from the cast, unscripted murmurings in Latin and Italian, and layered them into the background. The result was a soundscape that felt alive. Haunted, even. The film's composer, too, approached the score as liturgy. Rather than write conventional music cues, he created what he called sound shadows, melodic fragments that ebbed and flowed like chants. Strings would rise, then vanish. Dissonant chords would appear just under dialogue, never overwhelming, always unsettling. During the climactic voting scene, the music stops entirely. Just breathing. Just the scratching of pens on paper. That silence was intentional. It wasn't empty. It was sacred. Post-production brought its own batch of curiosities. Color grading sessions took twice as long as expected, because the director insisted that every candlelit scene feel like a Caravaggio painting, shadow and light locked in eternal conversation. And yet, for all the visual drama, the hardest thing to get right was the smoke. Yes, the smoke. The iconic plume that rises to signal a new pope? It became the bane of the visual effects team's existence. Getting the smoke to look real, its weight, its curl, its texture, without overusing digital tricks was a nightmare. The team went through over 30 variations before landing on one that felt appropriately sacred and tangible. It's not just smoke, the director insisted. It's the breath of a world waiting. Even marketing the film brought its own unexpected twists. The studio struggled with how to present it. Too spiritual for political thriller fans. Too political for audiences expecting religious drama. But once the trailer dropped, featuring no dialogue, just overlapping whispers and images of locked doors, tearful eyes, and endless red robes, curiosity bloomed. People didn't understand what the film was about. But they felt it. And that was enough. One of the final days of filming coincided with Ash Wednesday. Entirely unplanned. The cast and crew gathered at lunch, many still in costume, and stood together in silence. No sermon. No prayers. Just a moment. As one camera operator said later, we weren't making a film anymore. We were inside something. And when the film finally premiered, the response wasn't deafening. It was reverent. Screenings ended in long silences. Critics struggled to pin it down. It wasn't exactly a thriller. Not exactly a drama. Not exactly religious. But it stirred something. A sense of unease. Of reverence. Of reckoning. What had started as a script about choosing a pope had become a story about choosing truth, at great cost, in great silence, beneath the weight of centuries. And what made the production unforgettable wasn't the scale or spectacle. It was the conviction that even in fiction, there are sacred things worth treating with care. And sometimes, just sometimes, the candles don't need to be lit for something divine to flicker into the room. It's not a world of movement. There are no sprawling landscapes, no sweeping shots across cities or battlefields. This is a world of stillness, where every step echoes against marble, where the light itself seems to hesitate before touching the ground. It's a film where the setting doesn't just hold the story, it is the story. And from the first frame, it wraps around you like incense. Heavy. Haunting. Sacred. The film's entire soul is built within walls. Old ones. Grand ones. Walls that have seen centuries of silence and spectacle, faith and failure. The moment the camera enters this space, you feel it. A shift. As though the lens has passed through something invisible, some spiritual curtain, and now everything breathes a little slower, a little deeper. Because this isn't just a movie about people. It's about place. And the way place can carry memory like a secret. At the heart of it all is the Sistine Chapel. Not merely a replica, not just a soundstage, but a living, breathing version of something so sacred it almost feels dangerous to fake. The first time we step inside, the camera doesn't rush. It doesn't declare. It glides. Gently. Respectfully. We're not just being shown a room. We're being welcomed into a ritual. And the ceiling looms above like a god watching. Michelangelo's brushstrokes are there, rendered with such care that they don't feel like a backdrop. They feel like judgment itself. But it's not just the chapel. The entire film is shaped by corridors, long, winding, whisper-filled spaces that lead to places the public never sees. Narrow passages, stone stairwells, private chambers dimly lit by flickering bulbs or dusty chandeliers. There are rooms with windows that never open. Doors that creak not from age, but from the weight of secrets they've kept shut for decades. The Vatican, in this story, is less of a palace and more of a maze. A labyrinth carved from stone and silence, where every turn might reveal a truth, or another locked door. And that's what makes the setting so integral. It's not just the container of the drama. It's the pressure. The air feels thick not with smoke, but with consequence. Every character is boxed in, not just physically, but morally. They walk the same halls, pass the same statues, kneel in the same chapels, but none of them are free. The setting becomes a mirror, reflecting their fears, their ambition, their reverence. It shows who bends, who breaks, who kneels out of faith and who does it out of fear. The cinematography understands this perfectly. Light and shadow are not just tools here. They're characters in their own right. Daylight rarely enters. When it does, it feels accidental, slipping through stained glass, diffused through curtains, never direct. Most of the film is lit by candles, chandeliers, old lamps. The glow is soft, warm, almost holy, but never comforting. The shadows are long, deliberate, clinging to faces, stretching across floors like questions waiting to be asked. The camera doesn't linger on beauty for its own sake. Yes, there are moments where we see the grandeur, the towering ceilings, the golden ornaments, the aged tapestries. But even those are framed with a sense of melancholy. This is not opulence for glory. It's weight, history, a burden. The characters are small in the frame, swallowed by the institution around them. The scale reminds us, these men are temporary. The walls have seen hundreds like them. The church moves slowly, but it moves. And it remembers. Color, too, is used with extraordinary precision. Red dominates, as it must, the robes of the cardinals, the velvet of the chairs, the seals on sacred documents. But it's not the red of passion or romance. It's the red of power, of blood, of tradition. It's deep and heavy, not vibrant. The palette is subdued overall, earth tones, stone grays, candle golds. It grounds the story, reminds us that this world, for all its sanctity, is also made of dust and ash. And then, occasionally, a jarring contrast, a glimmer of something too bright, a hallway lit in sterile white, a file folder that doesn't belong. These elements are not accidents. They are disruptions. Visual cues that something modern, something foreign, is slipping into this ancient world. Most often, these come with Murray, the man who walks between tradition and change. His presence shifts the balance, and the lighting shifts with him. The camera often follows Murray closely. Shoulder level, steady, almost documentary-like. It watches him notice things, tracks his silence. When he moves through the Vatican archives or steps into chambers few ever see, the camera feels handheld, uncertain. Not shaky, but cautious. Like it's afraid to wake the ghosts. That tension, between reverence and revelation, is everywhere. Even the framing choices tell a story. It watches him notice things, tracks his silence. When he moves through the Vatican archives or steps into chambers few ever see, the camera feels handheld, uncertain. Not shaky, but cautious. Like it's afraid to wake the ghosts. That tension, between reverence and revelation, is everywhere. Even the framing choices tell a story. Characters are often boxed within doorways, seen through windows, reflected in mirrors. It's as if the film is constantly reminding us that no one is seen directly. That everyone, every cardinal, every glance, every whispered promise, is layered in reflections and angles. Nothing is as it appears. And when the power shifts, when the votes begin to lean toward danger, the framing grows tighter. More closed. Heads are cut off at the crown. Spaces seem smaller. The chapel, once grand, becomes suffocating. The mise-en-scene, the arrangement of everything within the frame, is crafted with near-religious precision. Objects matter. A chalice placed too neatly. A crucifix tilted slightly off-center. A journal left in the wrong drawer. The film doesn't use these details as props. It lets them speak. And for viewers who pay attention, they whisper constantly. They hint at unrest, at manipulation, at faith turned into performance. The vote sequences are among the most visually fascinating. They're shot almost like sacred dance. The cardinals line up. The parchment ballots are written, folded, dropped into the urns. The camera watches each gesture with reverence and dread. The ballots aren't just votes, they're offerings. Sacrifices. And the burning of those ballots? That plume of smoke, curling up and out over the city, it's more than a signal. It's a symbol of what's been erased. What's been hidden. What the world will never know. And when the smoke is black, the screen stays muted. Disappointed. But when it turns white, finally, after everything, the contrast is blinding. The light returns. The music swells. But the film doesn't celebrate. It exhales. Because that moment isn't about victory. It's about survival. One of the film's most daring choices is how rarely it leaves the Vatican. There are no wide shots of Rome. No cutaways to crowds until the very end. The world outside waits. Watches. But it is kept away. This allows the story to build a sense of isolation so intense that when the final bells ring and the doors open, it feels like a prison breaking. And yet, even in that moment, the tone remains reverent. The new pope steps forward, backlit. The light isn't divine, it's diffused. Gentle. He doesn't raise his arms. Doesn't gesture grandly. He just is. And the balcony scene, so often used in media as triumph, is filmed here as a transition. The camera doesn't linger on the crowd. It lingers on the Pope's face. And then, behind him, on the walls he will now carry. Critics and audiences alike noted that this film never lets the setting slip into background. It is the foreground. Every emotion, every theme, truth, power, legacy, doubt, is reflected in the spaces where the characters move. It's not a backdrop for drama. It's a living, breathing theology. And in that way, the setting becomes the truest character of all. It is ancient, unblinking, unmoved. And yet, in its shadows, change begins. Not loudly, not with force, but with the quietest step forward. Lit only by candlelight. Some films are made in chaos, others in joy. This one was made in a hush. Like everyone involved knew, even before the cameras rolled, that they were stepping into something fragile and strange. Something you didn't speak too loudly around. Something you respected, even when pretending. From the earliest days of pre-production, through the long, labyrinthine shoot, and into the final hours of post, the mood behind the scenes wasn't electric or frantic, it was reverent. But that didn't mean it wasn't filled with laughter, surprises, and 1,000 little stories that never made it to the screen. It all began with a question that couldn't be answered. How do you film something that, by its very nature, is meant to be unfilmable? The conclave is sacred. Sealed. What happens inside has remained largely unchanged for centuries, and perhaps more importantly, unseen. No cameras. No transcripts. No eyewitness accounts beyond what little the cardinals themselves have whispered in memoirs long after their terms ended. So the production team knew early on they were diving into the unknown. What resulted was less a set than a reconstruction of myth. The decision to build a replica Sistine Chapel, accurate down to the gold leaf cracks in the cornices, came from the director's insistence that nothing fake would ring true. The audience might not know what the real chapel looks like, he said during early meetings, but they know what truth feels like. And so they built it, brick by brick, brushstroke by brushstroke. It took 9 weeks, 3 scaffoldings, and a crew of painters who became so fluent in Michelangelo's visual language that they began adding subtle, playful nods into the corners. An extra angel wing here, a knowing expression in a painted cherub there. Most were too subtle to spot. But the crew knew. They called them whispers. During those long hours of set building, the mood remained eerily focused. The construction crew started speaking more softly without realizing it. Sound techs caught themselves taking off their hats indoors. One day, a lighting assistant crossed herself before adjusting a bulb above the altar, not because she was religious, but because something about the room made her pause. "I've worked on horror films, fantasy sets," she later said, but this was the first one that felt like it could actually listen. Once filming began, the energy shifted. Not to stress. To stillness. The actors were asked not to rehearse too loudly. Not because of noise issues, but because the director wanted them to protect the mystery of their lines. "Don't perform until we're recording," he'd say. "Let the chapel hear it first." He didn't just want the scenes to look sacred. He wanted the process to feel sacred. That made the environment strangely communal. Quiet camaraderie built in the silence between takes. The lead actor, cast as Murray, became something of a spiritual nucleus. He didn't command the room. He didn't tell stories in between setups or flirt with the extras. He read. He wrote. He sat in corners and studied the faces of the crew. He had a ritual of walking the full length of the chapel set every morning, hands behind his back, as if in private prayer. "He never told us what he was thinking," a grip recalled. "But you could feel it. Like he was already halfway in character before breakfast." Then there was the cast of cardinals. 40 actors, some of them veterans, others brought in for their faces alone. They were given robes tailored to their fictional rank. Robes that got heavier the closer their character was to the center of the story. It was a subtle trick, an emotional anchor. And it worked. Actors reported feeling different in the full vestments. More restrained. One joked that he stopped slouching out of respect for the costume. But while the roles were serious, the cast wasn't always. Between takes, the so-called Cardinals Club would gather in the green room, sipping espresso from paper cups and improvising mock homilies. One actor, whose booming voice could rattle the soundstage walls, developed a running bit where he'd fake being elected pope between scenes. "I'd like to thank the Academy, and of course the Holy Spirit," he'd intone, raising a coffee mug in solemn salute. Still, the gravity of the material never disappeared. Especially during the voting scenes. These were among the most technically demanding sequences in the entire shoot. Not for special effects, but for stillness. The camera had to float between rows of cardinals. Lighting had to mimic candlelight without casting modern shadows. Each movement had to feel choreographed without being theatrical. For those moments, the set would go silent. No laughter. No muttering. Just the scratching of pens, the soft rustle of robes. And then the ballots burned, and the smoke machine hissed, and the camera caught the way the fire reflected off the eyes of men who were pretending to decide the future. And sometimes the pretending got too real. During one of the first full run-throughs of the voting sequence, the actor playing Tremblay received more ballots with his name than expected. It wasn't planned. No one fessed up. But suddenly, the weight of the scene shifted. He stood, slowly, in the middle of the room, and for a breathless moment everyone wondered what he would do. It was electric, the director later said. The kind of mistake you don't correct. That take stayed in the final cut. Then there were the challenges that came not from performance, but from the set itself. The decision to use real candles, hundreds of them, meant the chapel grew hot, fast. Actors began sweating through their robes. Extras had to rotate out to avoid fainting. Eventually, the effects team rigged a hybrid system, real flames in the foreground, digital ones added later in the back. But by then, the damage had been done. The scent of beeswax and smoke lingered in everyone's clothes for weeks. One day, a smoke machine malfunctioned during a scene intended to be somber. Instead of a controlled puff, it released a massive plume, filling the room in seconds. Visibility dropped to 0. The cardinals disappeared in fog. One of the actors, refusing to break character, began reciting the Lord's Prayer as the fire alarm went off. It became a moment of unintended theater. The crew still refers to it as the Ascension. But for every mishap, there was a moment of quiet perfection. Like the day a prop master found a broken rosary on set, one that hadn't been brought in by the crew. No one claimed it. It wasn't part of the design. But it ended up in a crucial scene, tucked into the hands of a cardinal as he wrestled with a moral decision. Or the time a sparrow flew into the soundstage during the final week of filming, landed on the Pope's chair, and sat there, motionless, as if waiting to be seen. These were the kinds of things that couldn't be planned. That felt like echoes from something larger. Even the crew began to treat the process with more reverence than usual. The boom operator began wearing dress shoes instead of sneakers. The camera assistant stopped chewing gum on set. It wasn't about rules. It was something else. Something you felt, not because the script demanded it, but because the atmosphere asked for it. And then came the last day. The final scene had been shot. The robes were packed. The chapel would be torn down in a matter of hours. But before the lights dimmed for good, the cast and crew gathered in the center of the set. No speeches. No clapping. Just a moment of stillness. The director placed a single candle at the altar and let it burn. "We didn't build a film," he said softly. "We built a prayer." When the candle burned out, the chapel went dark. And somewhere, in the quiet that followed, you could almost hear the closing of a door. What the audience sees on screen is elegant, measured, deliberate. But behind those frames was a process shaped by reverence and accidents, by challenges and laughter, by a cast and crew who, for a brief stretch of time, gave themselves over to a story about faith, power, and truth. And somewhere, in between the robe fittings and smoke machines, in the errors that became brilliance and the moments no one could quite explain, something happened. Not a miracle. Not magic. Just cinema. Sacred and strange. It's a story dressed in robes and ritual, cloaked in candlelight and silence, but beneath all that pageantry is something aching and raw. A question whispered again and again behind closed doors and beneath centuries of tradition. What is truth? And what are we willing to do to protect or distort it? At its heart, the film is not about choosing a pope. It's about confronting what lies beneath that choice, the long shadow of human fallibility. This is not a movie of saints and sinners, but of men, each carrying belief and ambition in equal measure. Men who kneel not only to pray, but to position themselves. And in doing so, the story draws a clear line between faith as a calling and faith as currency. One of the central themes that emerges almost immediately is power through silence. The film doesn't shout. It doesn't rush. It unfolds like a liturgy, slow and methodical, drawing the viewer into a world where what isn't said is often more important than what is. The rituals of the conclave, the ballots, the locked doors, the incense, are not just religious customs. They are tools. Symbols of control masquerading as symbols of surrender. In this space, silence becomes the language of authority. The cardinals speak in glances, in pauses, in the withholding of truth. And nowhere is this more embodied than in Murray, the quiet outsider, called into the sacred inner circle without title or collar. His presence is a challenge to that silence. He is not there to vote, not there to campaign. He has been summoned to watch, and what he sees cracks the ornate facade wide open. He becomes the embodiment of the quiet conscience, a figure who doesn't speak loudly but whose very existence forces others to question themselves. He carries with him another of the film's great themes, truth without permission. The truth, in this story, is not explosive. It's buried, folded into letters, scattered across journals, lingering in the eyes of the dying Pope. It's not a bomb waiting to go off, it's a wound that refuses to heal. The symbolism here is rich. The Pope's final words, given not to a fellow cardinal but to a former priest who chose to leave, speak volumes. They suggest that sometimes only those who've stepped away from power can see it clearly. That truth, real truth, often comes from those who no longer have anything to gain by telling it. The setting reinforces this at every turn. The Vatican itself becomes a symbol, more than just a location. Its halls and chambers are not merely beautiful or historic. They're claustrophobic. They trap the characters within centuries of expectation and doctrine. The grandeur becomes its own kind of prison. The locked doors of the conclave aren't just literal. They represent the emotional and moral confinement that each character wrestles with. There's no escape. No windows. Only the ceiling to look up at. And what looms above them? Judgment. Michelangelo's The Last Judgment stares down at the cardinals as they vote. Not as decoration, but as a moral reminder. The painting becomes a character in its own right, a massive, silent witness to the sins, secrets, and struggles unfolding beneath it. Its presence is constant, unavoidable. A reminder that no matter how carefully power is brokered on earth, something higher is always watching. The ballots themselves become another powerful symbol. They're slips of paper, fragile and small. But in this world, they hold the weight of a nation, a church, a billion souls. The act of writing a name becomes an act of shaping history. And yet, these slips are burned, erased. Their contents turn to smoke before the world can see. The black smoke is more than a delay. It's a manifestation of uncertainty. And the white? It's not celebration. It's closure. A signal to the world that a decision has been made, even if it was built on compromise or concealment. But the most compelling theme running through the story is the tension between legacy and renewal. Cardinal Tremblay represents the legacy, young enough to appear progressive, but bound to an ideology rooted in preservation. He is the candidate of continuity, polished and charismatic, but not untainted. His campaign is subtle, built on quiet influence and unspoken promises. He stands for a church that looks forward with one eye and backward with the other. And for many in the conclave, that is comfort. But for others, including Murray and eventually Bellini and Silva, that comfort is a mask. Tremblay's rise isn't a hope for the future. It's a return to a status quo that conceals truth in favor of stability. And so, the theme of moral clarity over institutional loyalty begins to take shape. What matters more? The strength of the Church's image or the strength of its soul? Cardinal Ajayi becomes the reluctant symbol of renewal. He doesn't seek power, doesn't whisper or maneuver. He exists, quietly, as a reminder that leadership doesn't have to come from ambition. That perhaps the truest leaders are the ones who don't want the role. His eventual rise is not framed as victory, but as necessity, a balm for the wounds that have been left open too long. Throughout the film, the characters carry their own private symbols. Murray carries a journal, the Pope's final writings, a physical representation of unseen truth. It's small, easily hidden, but powerful. In his hands, it is not a weapon. It is a responsibility. Bellini carries regret, not in objects, but in posture. His slow movements, his weariness, speak of a man who once chose silence and paid for it. His eventual shift in allegiance is a kind of symbolic confession. Silva carries fire. He is the only one who seems willing to speak plainly, to challenge the silence that has settled like dust over the conclave. His passion isn't about rebellion, it's about faith in transparency. His support of Ajayi is not a political move, but a spiritual one, a leap of belief. And then there's the chapel door, closed with ceremony, sealed with sacred intent. It becomes a symbol not just of seclusion, but of transformation. What begins behind those doors cannot remain unchanged. The men who enter are not the same as the ones who leave. Some shed their illusions. Others cling harder to them. But all are tested. The door holds them accountable, not with force, but with presence. Even the smoke itself, rising again and again, carries weight. It drifts above the Vatican like a signal to the world. But what it says depends on who sees it. To some, it's a symbol of unity. To others, deception. The smoke becomes a blank canvas. Like faith itself, it can mean whatever the viewer brings to it. And perhaps that's what the film understands better than most, that the symbols of faith, when stripped of context, become hollow. A robe, a cross, a title. None of them carry meaning unless they are lived with honesty. The story doesn't mock these symbols. It reveres them. But it also demands they be earned. As the film draws to a close, and the white smoke finally rises, the world outside erupts. But inside, it is quiet. The Pope steps forward, not triumphant, but solemn. His face carries the weight of the decision, the knowledge of what was almost lost. And behind him, Murray watches, not in glory, but in silence. He has no role now, no robe, but he has done what he came to do. He carried truth through fire. And that is the final theme, sacrifice without spotlight. The film doesn't end with applause or recognition. It ends with endurance, with quiet perseverance, with a man who walked back into the walls of power not to change them, but to protect something buried within them. What emerges is a story that is not just about religion, but about belief. Belief in truth. Belief in those who protect it when no one is looking. And belief that even in the most ancient, immovable places, change is still possible, if someone, somewhere, is willing to speak softly and stand still. It was never going to be a film that screamed for attention. Not one that burst onto the screen with spectacle or spectacle's louder cousin, noise. Instead, this was a film built like a whisper, quiet, deliberate, and all the more powerful because of it. A film about inner walls, about secrets dressed in ceremony, about tension wrapped in stillness. And from its very first frames, the approach to crafting it, shot by shot, beat by beat, was less about showing and more about allowing the audience to feel like they were trespassing into something sacred. It began with an unusual directive from the director, shared on the very first day of production. We're not filming the Vatican. We're filming a fortress of the soul. That set the tone for everything that followed. The production wasn't just recreating architecture or ritual. It was building a cinematic vessel for themes too fragile to say out loud. The camera would have to see what wasn't shown. The sound would need to hum with hidden truths. Every cut, every frame, would have to move like a breath in prayer. One of the most immediately striking filmmaking choices was the film's commitment to spatial intimacy. The setting, while grand, was also claustrophobic. The halls of the Vatican, the chambers of Conclave, the endless curves of ancient stone corridors. They weren't shot wide and majestic, but tight and suffocating. This choice was intentional. The cinematographer, renowned for their ability to turn stillness into suspense, opted for prime lenses and fixed camera positions that framed characters within tight verticals, often trapping them between doorways, arches, or columns. The result? Even the most powerful men in the world looked boxed in, dwarfed by history and the immovable architecture of tradition. Lighting became its own character. Almost all interior scenes were lit to mimic real-world sources: candlelight, chandeliers, slivers of daylight sneaking through stone slats. There were no artificial flares or stylized glares. Instead, the visual mood was bathed in warm golds and deep shadows, often falling off into pools of complete blackness. Characters frequently stood in silhouette, their faces obscured or only partially lit, as if the film itself was unsure whether to reveal them or keep them hidden. In the voting sequences, light would pool over the parchment ballots, isolating them as holy artifacts, while the rest of the room remained dim. It gave the impression that the act of choosing was sacred, even if the motivations behind it were not. But perhaps the most genius choice in visual language came from how movement, or the lack of it, was used. Tracking shots were rare. When employed, they felt slow and reverent, almost like a procession. The camera didn't run or glide, it glided slowly, like breath. One long tracking shot, following Murray as he wanders through a forgotten corridor deep within the Vatican archives, became a signature moment. There's no dialogue. Just the soft echo of his shoes, the hum of old electric lights, the sound of distant bells. The shot lasted nearly 4 minutes without a cut. Critics called it the quietest unraveling of suspense in years. What was seen wasn't nearly as powerful as what was felt. And when stillness was needed, the filmmakers embraced it fully. There were scenes, especially in the early stages of the Conclave, where shots held for 30, even 40 seconds. No cuts, no music, just cardinals staring, breathing, waiting. These were risky choices in an era of rapid-fire editing. But they worked, because they allowed the audience to be locked in the same room as the characters. The discomfort became communal. Time stretched. The silence spoke. Sound design was handled with surgical care. This wasn't a film of crashing scores or emotional swells. It was one of subtle textures, soft footsteps on mosaic tiles, the scratch of pen on parchment, the distant creak of wooden pews. The ambient soundscape was layered with hidden meaning. The buzz of electric lights grew louder when a character was lying. Wind slipped through sealed windows as secrets were passed. Even the sound of a door closing was treated with significance, slow, resonant, final. The score, composed with restraint and reverence, acted more like a spiritual heartbeat than a traditional soundtrack. Instead of melodies, it was built around tones, low drones, Gregorian-inspired motifs, the occasional rise of strings that never fully resolved. The composer used voices, not words, but breath and hum, woven into the sound bed, so faint you only noticed them when they stopped. The silence that followed those breaks was often the most powerful moment in a scene. And then came the editing. This was not a film interested in conventional pacing. The editors, working closely with the director, refused to rush the story. They leaned into discomfort, into the power of a moment held just 1 second too long. Every scene was cut with an eye for restraint. Transitions were slow fades or simple dissolves, often from one quiet hallway to another, keeping the rhythm of the film contemplative and unrelenting. But even so, the tension never sagged, because the stakes were built into the silence. The most effective editing trick, used multiple times throughout the film, was mirrored action. Two cardinals walking in separate halls, their footsteps aligned. A ballot being cast as a prayer is whispered in another room. Murray reading the Pope's journal while Tremblay recites a public statement. These juxtapositions created a sense of divine dissonance, the idea that what we see and what we say are often worlds apart. Visually, The film played with symmetry and asymmetry to evoke deeper truths. Conclave scenes were almost mathematically precise. Rows of cardinals, identical robes, perfect formation. But scenes involving hidden knowledge or private confrontation were framed slightly askew. Off-center compositions, crooked lines, characters split by doorframes or shadows. It was an elegant visual metaphor. Order on the surface, chaos beneath. Symbolism in cinematography was never loud. It was suggestive. The journal Murray carries is always in frame when he's in a scene, sometimes visible, sometimes implied. Tremblay's face is never fully lit until the final vote. Ajayi, the eventual pope, is first introduced bathed in candlelight but surrounded by total darkness. These decisions weren't incidental. They were woven into the language of the film's visual narrative, guiding the viewer's perception without pointing a finger. When it came to the climactic scene, when the final vote is cast and the white smoke rises, the filmmakers could have gone big. Instead, they went inward. The moment unfolds almost entirely in silence. The ballots are counted. The camera doesn't cut. It stays fixed, watching as each cardinal watches the others. There's no music, just breath. Then the burning of the paper. Then the smoke. And only after the plume has drifted into the air does the score return. Soft, minor key, unsettled. Even victory feels haunted. As for the box office story, it unfolded like the film itself, slowly, unexpectedly, with resonance far beyond expectation. It premiered quietly, at a festival more known for indie dramas than global thrillers. The audience sat in silence after the credits. No applause at first. Just stillness. Then the murmurs began. Critics described it as a meditation disguised as a mystery, the most patient film of the year, a movie that dares to let silence be a character. Word of mouth did the rest. Despite having no explosions, no action set pieces, and a subject many studios once deemed too internal, it climbed. Audiences were drawn in not by spectacle, but by the promise of something different. Something thoughtful. Something that didn't rush to explain. By the end of its run, it had outperformed every box office prediction. It wasn't a phenomenon in the way blockbusters are, but it stayed. It lingered. It returned. People saw it twice, 3 times. Schools used it in ethics classes. Seminaries screened it. But so did indie theaters, art houses, even some mainstream chains looking for that film everyone whispers about. The beauty of its success wasn't just in the numbers, but in what it proved, that there's still room for cinema built on restraint. That audiences, if trusted, will rise to the occasion. In the end, the film's techniques were not tricks. They were convictions. To hold a shot longer than most would dare. To let sound become silence. To trust in faces. To show faith not as spectacle, but as struggle. And by doing so, it didn't just tell a story. It built a sacred space. And then it invited us inside.